And okay, looks like we are recording here. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the March 10th, 2025 meeting of the Citizens Climate Lobby Electrification Action Team. And today we have about a 15 or 20-minute presentation from Michael Metzner, one of our steering committee and finance manager, former CFO of renewable companies. He's going to talk a little bit about green banks and which were just funded middle of last year by the Inflation Reduction Act, and certainly have had some coverage in the news lately, and we'll talk about that. But the goal is to talk a little bit about this one particular aspect that's around a $20 billion piece of the $370 billion Inflation Reduction Act, how these green banks operate, what role they play in projects around the country, and how they work with other community organizations. And then we're going to talk about the very great uncertainty that exists in that space right now. Many of us have read the news and know that the new administration's Environmental Protection Agency is seeking to stop or claw back some of that money. And what implications does that have? And I don't think anybody has a perfect crystal ball, but we're going to look at the best crystal balls we all have and probably learn from each other and take that and think about how do we talk about electrification now as we approach Earth Month and we're out doing outreach and tabling and that kind of thing. How does CCL want to talk about electrification with the general public, with our state and local electeds, with our national electeds? So just a minor and inconsequential agenda for today, I think. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Michael and get started. Before I do that, I want to just have a quick pulse check, see if anybody has any questions before we get going. Okay, hearing none. Thanks so much. One last introduction. I should have mentioned we have a couple of guests with us in addition to our CCL Electrification Team Steering Committee that you see here. We have from the U.S. Green Building Council, Suzanne Harther. Hello, Suzanne. Thank you for joining us. And from the Montgomery County Green Bank in Montgomery County, Maryland, we have Steve Morel, CEO of that fine institution. And after Michael talks, Steve is going to give us a little bit of boots on the ground and real world information about how the green banks are operating. Okay, with that, Michael, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Sounds good. Can you flip up the slides, Pete? Or you share your screen? There we go. Okay, welcome everybody, and thanks for taking time out of your schedules to discuss green banks. We've budgeted about 20 minutes for this presentation, as Pete said, followed by Q&A. Next slide, Pete. As for the agenda, what I'm hoping to leave you with is an understanding of the existing green bank landscape, what green banks are, what they do, how they help get projects built, and a deeper dive into the new green bank landscape catalyzed by the Inflation Reduction Act. I'll then turn it over to my co-leads and Stephen to talk about how it all works in the real world, followed by a discussion led by Pete on different approaches to speaking with the public about electrification. Next slide. Next slide again. So what are green banks? Green banks are public, quasi-public, or nonprofit financial institutions that use public and private capital to pursue clean energy goals. Generally, they are initially capitalized with public funds, either from federal, state, or local, and they leverage those funds to raise private capital. Among other things, they may offer below market rate loans that fill a financing gap at a rate the project can still be viable. They may take risks the market is not currently accepting, such as the borrower's credit. They may provide support to other lenders in underserved markets, which can either be financial or procedural to lower barriers for those lenders in the markets that are currently underserved. And perhaps most importantly, in doing all of the above, green banks improve access to clean energy projects and related economic benefits for low and moderate income communities. So they're mission driven, oftentimes with targets set around serving those communities. Now, to be clear, green banks are not a giveaway program. They expect to be repaid and even make a profit. And in fact, from what I understand, over 99% of these loans have been repaid so far from the current state green bank. The main idea is that any subsidies green banks provide in whatever form, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, are offset by the health, climate, and economic benefits they catalyze. That's the idea anyway. Next slide. So we covered most of these points on the last slide, so let's just focus for a minute on the last bullet, administered by state, local agencies, or nonprofit organizations. This is just to let you know that usually legislative action by a local or state government can be used to create either a new entity to serve as a green bank or to repurpose an existing entity in the form of a green bank. The other way they get formed is a nonprofit. This can be established as green banks. This process typically does not require the legislation and authorization needed to establish a green bank as a government entity. Some level of government support is important, but government dependency could partially slow the formation of or limit the operating flexibility of a green bank, as we are seeing play out in real time now. More on that later. Okay, next slide, please. Examples of projects. And this doesn't capture them all. I noticed this list doesn't have charging stations, which could be, but for everything, this slide shows several examples of projects supported by green banks. They range from low and moderate income residential energy efficiency and electrification projects to bike lanes, pedestrian walkways, from mass transit to climate adaptation, charging stations. We'll take a look in a minute at a couple specific examples, but first let's answer the question, what exactly do these institutions do? What are some of the common techniques used by green banks to help get projects financed? They're shown up here. We'll just maybe talk about a couple of them. First, credit enhancements. So loan loss reserves or loan guarantees, for example, help de-risk investments for private investors, enabling more capital to flow to clean energy projects. So by the green bank stepping in and providing those loan guarantees or setting up a reserve gives more comfort to the private lender who feels now they can get more of a market-based return with market-based risk. If a private lender is hesitant to enter a new market or is only willing to do so at very high interest rates, credit enhancements can provide security to that lender, resulting in improved deal economics for the borrower. Another technique that's listed here is aggregation warehousing, which basically says the green bank can kind of build up the scale economies needed so that there are usually inefficiencies of scale in a single private investment in the small geographically dispersed projects like residential or small business energy efficiency projects. So if you pool these loans, together, and if they're bundled, you can diversify the risk and achieve scale, and the projects then become far more attractive to lenders. So a green bank can accomplish this by underwriting loans directly and warehousing them until scale is reached. Next slide, Pete. The first green bank in the U.S. was in Connecticut in 2011. They're now, at least by my understanding, about 23 green banks in 17 states, including Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, California, Louisiana, and Maryland. 25 other states are exploring the concept. The existing green banks have raised and invested about $2.5 billion, and then using that $2.5 billion to leverage an additional $6.5 billion of private funds. The New York Green Bank is the largest in the U.S. It's invested $1.7 billion, which includes their original billion that they were capitalized with, plus from turning that over in the form of loans, that's now 1.7 billion, plus another 3.5 of private funds, 3.5 billion of private funds. As I mentioned before, over 99% of these green bank loans have been repaid. What we'll see in a minute is that the IRA, through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the Inflation Reduction Act, through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, authorized about 10 times the original capitalization of the 23 state green banks combined. So with that act and the federal government stepping in, it really is catalyzing or will catalyze this whole green bank movement. Next slide. Examples of existing state green bank financings. So this slide shows just two of many projects financed by existing state green banks. One is from Connecticut, Manchester, Connecticut. Solar PV, that's systems in 7 municipal buildings, 6 schools. The project savings were 2.1 million versus the over the term of 2.1 million in savings for electricity over the term of the power purchase agreement, which was like a 33% discount to grid power. The other is from New York. The Albany Hyatt was renovated, and it was a decarbonization project supported by a 12 million term loan from the Green Bank of New York. And that supports the construction of an all-electric hotel at a recovered brownfield site in downtown Albany for the benefit of disadvantaged communities. Next slide, Pete. And one more. So as mentioned earlier, the Inflation Reduction Act mandated $27 billion for a new greenhouse gas reduction fund to be administered by the EPA. The EPA in turn used $20 billion to capitalize 8 and first of their kind national green banks. These new green banks, just like existing state green banks, will do all of the things you see on this slide and more to catalyze many billions of dollars of additional public and private capital for clean energy infrastructure. They will partner with hundreds of communities throughout the country to invest thousands of clean energy projects like the ones we discussed. The next slide shows a picture of how this works. You can go to that slide. So you can see the 27 billion mandated by the IRA forms what we call the GGRF, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The EPA in turn created 3 intermediary funds: the National Clean Investment Fund, the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, and Solar for All. And they were funded with a combined amount of 27 billion. Those 3 funds then ran extensive application processes, resulting in awarding the 20 billion combined from the NCIF and CCIA funds to 8 national green banks. Solar for All funds, which will be distributed as direct grants to solar installers, have not yet been awarded at the time of this presentation, I think. Jay could correct me on that when we get to the end. The next 3 slides describe the 8 green banks in more detail. You can go to the next slide, Pete. There are 3 awardees that make up the National Clean Investment Fund. They're the grant recipients. And Power Forward Communities is the one on the left of the slide there, received the $2 billion award. It's a nonprofit coalition of 5 of the country's best known climate and community investment groups, which includes Rewiring America and United Way Worldwide, Habitat for Humanity, and others. The Coalition for Green Capital received $5 billion award. It will focus on leveraging a growing national network of green banks with at least 50% of investments in low-income and disadvantaged communities. I'm sorry, going back to Power Forward Communities, they're going to be dedicated to decarbonizing and transforming housing, American housing. So they all have somewhat similar missions, but there are some distinctions. Climate United Fund, which received $7 billion award, will partner with community development financial institutions, CDFIs, or like local financial institutions, concentrating on hard to reach market segments. So they're going to focus on consumers, small businesses, small farms, community facilities, and schools, with at least 60% focused on low income and disadvantaged communities. There's a lot of news lately about this particular institution. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Specifically, awards has been frozen by the new EPA administrator, and that's headed to court. Next slide. Opportunity Finance Network. This is looking at the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator grant. That's the second program, and three major grantees. Opportunity Finance Network received $2.3 billion award, and they're going to provide capital and capacity building for a national network of 400 plus local community lenders. Inclusive, which received almost $2 billion, 1.9, is going to provide capital also and capacity building for a network of 900 plus regulated credit unions, mission-driven regulated credit unions. And Justice Climate Fund,
Hello.
which received $940 million, is supported by a network of more than 1,200 local community lenders, and it's going to focus on providing responsible clean energy capital and capacity building for community lenders across the country. And then the last two, also part of the accelerator. One is Appalachian Community Capital with $500 million award. They're launching something called the Green Bank for Rural America to deliver clean capital to hundreds of community lenders working in coal country, coal and fossil fuel country, underserved rural and tribal communities. And then finally, the Native Community Development Financial Institution Network, which received a $400 million award and serves as a national voice and advocate for 60 plus Native CDFIs. Next slide. So that's all the good stuff and sort of what's happening and how this money, this public money, is meant to catalyze all these private funds, and right down to the community level, also addressing climate justice and economic benefits for moderate and low income communities. Now, what are the risks? Well, I just thought I'd just sort of share some of these headlines because I think it speaks for itself, and then maybe we can have a conversation. So let's turn to the risks of the GGRF under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund under the new administration. This slide shows a list of recent headlines through March 4th. They actually only kind of get worse after that regarding clawback of funds. They go from not so bad to pretty bad. I'll call out a few of them. November 20th, business as usual. Why the 27 billion Green Bank could survive Trump. Hey, the money's been, allocated. Everything's going to be okay. January 29th, utility drive. Trump funding freeze leaves Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and IRA projects in limbo. February 13th, 2025, Trump EPA aims to claw back 20 billion in Green Bank funds. Down to March 4th, EPA 20 billion funding freeze leaves Green Bank nonprofits unable to pay bills. And then the most recent one that Jay shared with us this morning, Canary Media, March 8th, 2025, Climate Coalition, and this is Climate United they're talking about. Climate Coalition launches lawsuit against Trump freeze. Next slide. Last slide. So in summary, Green Bank's kind of key points. Green banks play a vital role in meeting climate goals by stepping up to fill the financing gap left by private investors, and to catalyze those private funds. In April 2024, the IRA funded and EPA administered Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund created 8 new national green banks capitalized with 20 billion, many times the original capitalization of existing state and local green banks, of which 14 billion was set aside for low income and disadvantaged communities. These mission-driven financial intermediaries will mobilize private capital and deliver clean energy and climate solutions to communities across America. However, noted on the prior slide, the new EPA administrator, Lee Zeldin, froze the awardees' access to the $20 billion in grants. Now, there's a distinction there. It's really only the Climate United funds that are technically frozen, but they're not out of the woods in the other funds either, alleging malfeasance and or mismanagement. Situation is fluid, to say the least. It'll likely play out in the courts in the weeks and months ahead, so stay tuned. Given recent developments, I think what we're going to do now is just pivot to a discussion about what we all can do to help these organizations in any small way, what we can do to help them regain access to these funds. With that, I will turn it back to Pete.
All right, great. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate that. Before we dive into the free-flowing discussion, what I'd like to do is give Steve Morel a few minutes. Steve, just give us your boots on the ground approach to what you all are doing and how things are playing out, and then maybe you could tee up our discussion about the way forward with what you're seeing as far as the risk picture in the new administration.
Sure. Well, happy to. Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for that presentation, Michael. I always like to say that when you get advocates on your side, they can do the presentations for you. So I have nothing to add. That was really great. Appreciate that quite a bit. Like I said, my name is Steve Morel. I'm the CEO of the Montgomery County Green Bank in Maryland. My background is in energy finance. I worked with large scale utility finance internationally for most of my career. And that took me into the blended finance space, working with a lot of multilateral institutions that bring in public funds in order to catalyze private capital, and really saw the success of that. So the first job locally that I ever took was with the Montgomery County Green Bank, which was really a startup at the time. But knowing the capability of blended finance to achieve all the things that were on Michael's slide about the tools that green banks have is absolutely true at a local level. And so the only shock that came to me when I started working at the local level was, rather than in the project finance world, sitting back with developers that are really trying to develop big projects, there's a lot of financial structuring that goes behind them. At a community level, it was more about how do we fit in to support the local businesses and become more interested in investing in this as an asset class for their own purposes, for saving operational funds, for working with their local banks. There was already a free-flowing movement of capital for a lot of businesses, but how do we actually underwrite to energy savings? And so that was kind of an interesting question that we came to at a community level. And the Green Bank movement is, in general, very interesting to me because that was the natural progression in the market. The entire movement actually started at a national level with the United Kingdom, Singapore, Australia, putting out green banks at a national scale. And as Michael said, when they came to the United States, they came to Connecticut and they came to New York. And eventually we as a county were able to get started with support of the county and get capitalized by public funds from at that time was a ratepayer settlement from the merger of two utilities, but now an annual appropriation from the county. And so the focus has always continued to shift to a community level, which is fascinating in my mind and absolutely needed for why we do the work that we do. So to me, still green banks are so fascinating because they're different things to different people. From that public side, they're a mechanism to take a limited amount of public funds and stretch them further using financial leverage. And so a lot of jurisdictions like Montgomery County, like New York, like Connecticut, have ambitious climate goals that they're trying to achieve. When it comes to electrification, for example, we in the county have building energy performance standards that now have tough regulations that all the local property owners and developers need to meet. And the funds to be able to get there certainly don't exist at a public level. But once you start to lever them with private capital, they do exist as you start to bring in 5 times and 10 times the amount of those public funds. So that's really the key from the public side. To the capital market side, it's exactly as Michael was saying. There's a real need for a demonstration effect where people are not going to be investing in certain types of projects out there because of the economics of the project, the perceived credit of the project, the type of portfolio management that they may see from investing in these types of projects. And so having a green bank step in is actually really dragging those capital providers along, many of whom are looking for entrance into the market, but can't find them. And then, of course, the green banks are everything to those that actually use them in terms of project knowledge and project demonstration, being able to actually, retrofit a building for your office space and seeing the operational savings that come out of it. So it's kind of a fascinating situation of green banks being a little, I would say, amorphous until people start to see what they're actually doing. And then depending on how they're utilizing them, they know exactly what they do. Another way that I put this kind of in a joking way when I speak publicly is green banking really has the unfortunate three stages of denial in terms of trying to get folks to utilize them. The first is that people don't always see that there's an economic value proposition to investing in energy efficiency, clean energy, climate resilience. And so we have to start by telling that story, and that's the key. And so as you look at our website, as our annual report, as the collateral material that we initially send out to the market, it's about telling that story first and foremost. And then once they understand that economic value proposition, it's about how does finance actually help in this situation? And as you can imagine, especially with a lot of small businesses, multifamily housing around, low income, disadvantaged communities, there are a lot of organizations that do not have the resources for the upfront investment into these activities. They're not looking for a high rate of return. They're looking to get this stuff done for savings purposes. So using a financing strategy that allows them to not put any capital up front, to in some cases have savings that exceed the amount of debt service that they would owe, is also kind of like a light bulb shining off on top of people and why they would want to move forward. And so that's kind of the second stage that they cross. And once they get there, they say, well, gosh, I've never heard of the green bank. So that's the last one that we have to cover. And so when we tell that story, that helps people understand what we do, how it's particular value to them. That's certainly the case as we talk about electrification. And that's certainly the case as we talk about the multiple funding sources that are out for green bank activities. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund was really and still is, a once in a generational activity to be able to capitalize a lot of green banks so that they're in every single state, every single community, and that these financial instruments are out there producing a lot of financing receivables essentially from projects on the ground. And that's of particular interest in my view, because then you can take all of those to the capital markets and bundle them and have as much of a productive liquidity market as you find in auto loans, as you find in mortgages. The real idea is then you crowd in those big institutional investors. But as it stands currently, those industries don't know the rates of default. They don't know why you would, invest in a portfolio of clean energy projects or electrification projects out there until we actually do it more. And then we can create those demonstration projects. So it's been an exciting industry for me to be in. I think that I appreciate this conversation significantly for how communities can now think about defending the GGRF, how they can think about speaking about electrification and what's the rationale behind that. And I would just throw in one other reason of why we particularly focus on electrification here in Maryland, and that's primarily because energy prices need to come down. We are really interested in investing in electrification as DER ready, meaning that we have a whole suite of connected demand response activities out there that could be aggregated into virtual power plants that can essentially replace a lot of the expensive generation sources out there and bring the price of electricity down while at the same time increasing reliability as well as meeting our climate goals. So it's a real win across all the board, particularly from an economic value. And that's really one of the main purposes of us as a green bank in the region. So happy to answer any questions I really appreciate the invitation tonight.
I'll get one to get it going. There's no others. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm not muted. I noticed one of the techniques, Steve, is this on bill financing using sort of the utility. Wonder if you have any experience with that because in some ways it makes sense. Okay, these are additional costs being borne, by the municipality or the state. We could finance it in this way. On the other hand, it could deter people from, we're trying to keep electricity cheap so people switch, right? So it can have sort of offsetting effects. I'm wondering if you've seen it in practice.
We certainly do. We have a couple on-bill financing programs that we've participated in with the utilities. There's others here in Maryland. There's certainly others all around the country as well. And what's interesting from the capital provider perspective is if you think about financing programs that are tied to people's bills, they tend to get paid more regularly than they do for standalone loans. And so, utility attached financing is exactly how, for example, sewers are financed out there, is exactly how you see a lot of high sources of repayment for energy efficiency. You also highlighted commercial PACE, property assessed clean energy out there, which is the same theory that if a CPACE loan is actually attached to the property and repaid on the property taxes, you'll find repayments a lot higher. So I think that the products were initially developed by capital providers thinking about how to have more certainty over time. But there's also a lot of value in the net benefiting that you can see. Utilities are very, very interested in being able to save for meeting RPS standards, for fixing load curves that are out there. It's heavily in their advantage to offer utility-based financing at 0% capital out there because ultimately they'll be able to meet their goals. So that's the program that we have locally. Is it's a small business program. People can get 2-year loans at 0%. And it's then repaid on your utility bill. And it's very effective. When we first launched that about 7 years ago, we saw a huge influx of people doing LED light conversions, which is kind of one of the low-hanging fruits of activities you can do for building energy efficiency out there. Very quick payback, very big impact in terms of GHG offset. And ultimately, people got 0% financing out there to do it. So I'm always a big proponent of on-bill financing to get those projects done.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's a great overview. Do you usually kind of lead the loan activity, or are you participating alongside others? And are your criteria pretty much the same as banks, or do you have additional requirements?
Yeah, that's a great question because green banks across the country differ really based off of their, I'd say, level of sophistication over time. And that was the case with us as well. When we first started, we did a lot of credit enhancements where we were not even injecting capital into the project capital stack itself. We basically put aside loan loss reserves or partial guarantees to support other people's capital. It was a great leverage factor because it was all other people's capital. The challenge was that we weren't driving the bus and moving fast enough in terms of achieving our goals. It left too much to those other capital providers to put in their own discretion. And one of my pet peeves was that it's been a challenge for those capital providers, local community banks, larger banks, funds, to underwrite deals to the energy savings of that deal as opposed to the kind of traditional credit mechanisms. I don't like credit scores. I don't like people taking, first liens on their properties or the types of, mortgaging their house to be able to do these kind of things. There's a lot of traditional finance, especially for small businesses, that just never provided enough recognition to the types of deals that we were doing and the cash flow generated from them. So over time, we shifted and we started putting more of our own capital in the deals where we would go out and originate them. We would underwrite them. We would issue and be the lender of record, essentially, but we would sell participations lend to the other banks. We would also syndicate on the back end. And it turned out that other banks really liked that quite a bit because it de-risked a bit, especially if they could buy something after construction. They felt as though they weren't taking any construction risk at all. So that's how we really got into doing more and more of our own. We don't have the same underwriting criteria as banks, but we certainly have enough of a credit and sustainability mindset so that, as you know, Michael was saying, we're not just ultimately giving out credit, or we're not giving out grants. That this is all finance activity, and we're trying to demonstrate the very low default rates that we see. And so we want to make sure to have that clear demonstration to the market. So, you know, we're not giving away funds in an adverse selection type of environment, knowing that we're never going to see it back, because that's just not helpful for the demonstration. So in that aspect, we are very similar to other banks, but we don't have prudential capital ratios. We don't have the same kind of pricing rules or anything like that, so that we get a little more flexibility.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so we're a little over halfway through our hour. I'd like to mention one guest we have, Dana Nuccitelli from CCL staff. And Dana, just want to give you the opportunity to jump in here if you have anything you'd like to add to the conversation.
No, thanks. I'm just here to listen today.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. Um, So yeah, at this point, then let's just go ahead and open up to sort of open mic, jump into the chat and or just into the verbal conversation, and we've got plenty of expertise here to answer questions. And I guess the other, and maybe it's time to do the pivot that I talked about earlier. Um, we in the Electrification Action Team Steering Committee have been talking about this and planning this webinar for 2 or 3 months. And in the last month, it got really fuzzy with all of the administration's attempts to stop the funding and claw it back. And we wondered if we should either postpone or cancel this webinar because of the high degree of uncertainty. And we decided no, because we've seen also several discussions in CCL's forum. There was a great thread in the tabling forum kicked off by Michael Reichling in Cleveland. There was a great thread in the group leaders forum kicked off by Deirdre Henderson in Tahoe, California. And, just people wondering, okay, we like talking about electrification, but the Inflation Reduction Act has always been a big part of what we talk about. And suddenly it feels very, maybe even disingenuous to be talking about the Inflation Reduction Act since there's so much risk. And so I think what we've heard is the first half of the hour, we heard a lot about here's how the green banks do work, the existing ones. Here's how the new federal ones are supposed to work. And I guess the risk from the administration, certainly, Michael teed up out of the 8 green banks, Climate United Fund is at greatest risk. They're the ones whose award was made last, just in the last 2 or 3 days of the Biden administration. And literally, because there was a 3-day holding period in Citibank, which was the bank that transferred the money from the government to the green banks, the $7 billion was still sitting in Citibank, and the Trump administration's EPA put a freeze on it on day 1 or day 2 of that administration before they could get it out. So that's the money that's at highest risk, but there's certainly a lot of uncertainty across the board. And just wanted to basically describe that and then, see what questions people have or suggestions for, gee, how is my chapter going to talk about electrification, that kind of thing. Now, I've never known all these CCLers to be shy, so let's get it out there.
So Pete, this is Jay, let me just add a couple things to the, the risk profile, as we call it, around the federal funding. Number one is, at least in my experience, and as I've been talking to folks, is the mode right now is to, living within the realm of some uncertainty and what risks you can bear to move forward, right? And keep moving forward as you go and adapt as you go. So one of the organizations, for example, that I'm on, Life Cycle Building Center, we have funding that we've gotten through Department of Energy's prize programs, and we've got one prize, we're not going to be eligible for the other one because they can't X the program, right? But we're going to take that money and keep going, and we're going to find ways to funding beyond what we thought we would have been able to do in 6 months from now. And that seems to be a standard cry I'm hearing out there among folks of finding ways to continue on. So I wanted to put out there that there's this philosophic view of organizations to say, yeah, we've got a degree of uncertainty. We may take some financial risk, but maybe we're more at risk by doing nothing than continuing on. And maybe that was part of the goal. So I wanted to kind of pass that along. Regarding the greenhouse gas reduction funds, and this could also include the solar for all. And there's really two things that, I see that are going to be underway. One is is to look at, are the entities that have been awarded the money, are they complying with the terms and conditions of their cooperative agreement or the grant, right? So part of what you're going to see is you're going to see EPA really looking very closely at terms and conditions, and that if someone goes out of compliance, does that go out of compliance mean, do you either not, pull back money or do you terminate, right? So that'll be one. So, it's about those entities that have been awarded to meet the performance goals and the terms and conditions of those grants. The second piece that you're seeing, and that was highlighted today, is the idea of, are the organizations appropriately using the funding? And another way of saying, are they not using the funds in the way that they were intended to be used? So that's where you see folks like DOJ will be asking questions about things like, what's your bylaws say, what's your procedures and processes for those that got the award, because they're going to be looking for vulnerabilities that could be an area for investigation about inappropriate use of funds. And I think those are the two things we're going to see play its way out beyond just the court case. That's probably going to be underway for, the next, certainly through the end of this year, probably as long as these grants are in place, they'll probably be out there. So I just wanted to maybe highlight the tactics that are underway right now that might be helpful for folks to understand.
Thanks, Jay. Matthew.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, a couple of questions. We do not, in my community, we do not have a sustainability plan. There's a local nonprofit that has been charged with doing that and has been kind of slow to do it. They did get a grant recently, and I believe it was from one of these programs, although I'm not positive of that. A grant to get busy on that, to finally have a sustainability plan in our county. Do any of you know which one of the funds that would have been from, or from any of them? Am I right that it would have been from one of these, or did that money come from someplace else? I'm trying to figure out, having not called them yet, I'm trying to figure out whether it's still shut off.
So, Matthew, from what I'm hearing, and you can look it up you can go to the EPA website to see. If you know the name of the community organization, that's one thing, but it sounds like to me it's probably one of the climate pollution reduction implementation grants, particularly if it was given to a local government. That's probably, by what you're saying, and they're going to do a climate action plan and implement. That's what it sounds like to me, but I could be wrong. But you could certainly look under the CPRG website. You should be able to pull up both the grantee and their plan and see what they committed to do. They should be online.
CPRG. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, climate pollution reduction implementation grants. Okay. And there are planning grants that went out first to planning entities, states and regional commissions representing large cities that became the basis for the implementation grant work plans to be developed. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. Second, real quick question. The loan programs office, is that similar to this stuff or is that a different thing? Jay, you're shaking your head. It must be different.
Yeah, the loan you're thinking of the Department of Energy Loan Programs Office.
I think I am. Yeah, the GGRF.
Yeah, yeah.
That's different from this.
That's different, and that funding flows through many different mechanisms, but typically you'll see that through research institutions like Georgia Tech has a big one for doing direct carbon air capture and carbon sequestration. So you have to track those a little bit differently through the individual developers that they work with for those deployments.
Okay, thanks.
And Jay, if I could add my 2 cents, the big kind of program design difference you see between those two is that Loan Programs Office is very heavily focused on technology. And so they've looked for innovative technology development over the years, whereas the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund insisted on what they called proven technology for every underlying project that they were funding. So one of the big differences that you see there. And unfortunately, Jigger, who is a Maryland resident, has moved on from LPO, which was not unexpected.
All right, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, another question or two for Steve. So can you say how your fund was actually set up? And also, the audience that we're talking to today is across the country. How would they look locally to find out if there are green banks in their areas that projects they want to pursue might be able to pursue?
Yeah, no, great questions. So of the varieties that Michael described at the beginning were the nonprofit kind. So we were created by the county through law, but we are a nonprofit 501c3 financial intermediary. So the county has a couple seats on our board, but it's an independent self-selecting board. And that's in comparison to an organization like the New York Green Bank, which is a subsidiary of NYSERDA, which is the New York Energy Office, among other things. And so that one is within the governmental apparatus. So these are kind of the two main flavors of green banks out there. I think each has their own respective advantage and disadvantage. And you see those being developed across the country. The development across the country has been very rapid. Now, unfortunately, a lot of it has been focused on developing because of the GGRF. But my sense is that development is going to continue regardless. And so there's two places to look. There's an organization called the GB50, the US Green Bank 50, which has a very simple website because it just got launched recently. And it's really becoming one of the main industry groups for green banks across the nation, including many of the nascent green banks that are just popping up in New Mexico, in Alaska, in Missouri, and places that have not existed before, Iowa. And so the GB50 is a great source to see. The other is called the American Green Bank Network. And it works, very similarly to the GB50, but under the Coalition for Green Capital umbrella, one of the main awardees that was highlighted. And so ABGN, I know this is all acronyms out there, but the websites highlight a lot of the green bank development that's out there. And then if you really don't see anything from those two, the local energy office is really the best resource to figure out what may be happening. There are a lot of green banks and green bank-like entities popping up at a local level, particularly in states that may be less friendly to having a statewide entity called a green bank. And so you'll see some local developments if you're in kind of a population center as well. For example, the Columbus area has developed a green bank, and there's others dedicated to specific solar activities in parts of Florida, things like that. So those are the best resources to take a look for local green bank activity.
That's terrific. Thank you.
Can I just ask one follow-up on that, Mark, if you don't mind? Steve, could you, and I think, part of this is the difference between a green bank and a CDFI, right? A community development finance institution. And, can CDFIs also serve, for lack of a better word, as a lot of times I do gap mechanisms or some of those guarantees, but do you see that as a way of growing green banks, through CDFIs? Is there a relationship there that needs to be explored and that you've seen? And I don't know. I've worked with CDFIs, but I don't know if I see the transition to green banks in the way that you articulated, right? Where they go beyond just being that gap or being that, guarantor in some cases for individual lenders.
Yeah, I think to an extent we're all coming up with monikers that make sense to the market, but there's so many similar activities among CDFIs, green banks, even credit unions and community banks, that they're ultimately all in part, if not entirely in their portfolio, doing very similar activities. So the CDFI community is a very natural connection for green banks. There are, in fact, a couple green banks that either have also become CDFIs or they're in the process of becoming CDFIs. So they act a bit as both. And really, the official designation is just if you're a CDFI and as regulated by the Treasury Department, you have access to the CDFI fund, which is a source of liquidity out there that you can use to do activities. It is more of a regulated form of banking activity than the green banks out there. Like ourselves, we're a nonprofit financial intermediary where we follow a lot of the statutory guidelines that were set up, but we're not regulated from the same sense as other banks. And that's done on purpose for that kind of flexibility. But yeah, there's a lot of collaborative nature that can exist between green banks and CDFIs. What's interesting, one of the largest conferences for CDFIs is OFN's national conference. And 2 years ago, I spoke on a panel related to green banking, and it was one of, I think, 3 times that green banking was mentioned. And this last year, I went, and almost the entire conference for OFN was about how CDFIs get in the green market. And it was just real pleasure to see that CDFIs in particular have a lot of capital looking to be in this space. They don't necessarily have the expertise related to underwriting clean energy transactions. They have a lot more expertise underwriting things that we're looking for impact on in terms of housing, in terms of other community development activities. So we actually need to work together more, and we're just starting to see that. So they're very similar institutions and good partners to work with each other.
Thanks. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Just so you know, OFN, I helped them with their application before I went back to EPA. So we had a good conversation about that.
Nice. Joanne.
Hi. Thank you for this really interesting conversation. I did want to take you up, Pete, on your question about tabling and just ask the group if anybody has experience using angles at tables such as, the efficiency, quiet, clean benefits, or another issue that comes up a lot, which is how to work with contractors who aren't familiar with heat pumps. In other words, I'm wondering if anybody has some resources beyond the IRA that we can use for promoting electrification at tables.
Sure. Well, 2 real quick things. The Electrification Action Team does have a couple of decks that might help. One of the things that I talk about a lot when tabling is induction cooking. I take a portable induction cooktop with me. I boil water and I stick a $1 bill or a $20 bill under the pot. And I talk about the safety and the health benefits of that a lot. And that really gets a lot of eyes open. We've got some other material in our decks, and I'll share links in a follow-up post in the forum after this with links to some decks. But let me shut up and let others chime in.
And I'll say I do have a gas stove flyer from our state chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics that I've used also. If you'd like, I'll pass that along. It's pretty good.
Oh, yes, please.
So-
We've got somebody working on that out here with Physicians for Social Responsibility, and they're working with the Building Decarb Coalition to develop that. But glad to hear there's already something there. And what a perfect organization to have it, the Academy of Pediatricians.
And I would take it a step further, Pete, and say you ought to bring, if you can, bring clinicians to your table to talk about the health aspects of energy efficiency and all that as well. And then the other part I would suggest is, as part of those networks you're talking about, believe it or not, those that provide services are usually locally, inclined, and it's passed through people that done work that share it with someone else that does it. So if you can find examples of people that have done electrification and energy efficiency projects to bring them to the table, that they can share who they used and how they did it, you would be surprised. I mean, when I tell people, I was able to add a mini split and reconfigure my upstairs, and I added a mini split for installation and purchase for $1,200, right? And that was through my local HVAC guy that I talked to. I know him well, and I said, "Here's what I want to do." He says, "I like doing that. I can do that." And I said, "Well, tell me what unit to buy." And he says, "Here's the one I researched. Why don't you buy it? It'll be cheaper." I went to Amazon, bought it, and he said, "I'll install it for $500, including running a 120 line, dedicated 120 line." Pretty good deal. So I think a lot of these deals we're looking for and how we do it, it's really around finding people that do it, that have done it, and getting them to talk to other people that are interested in doing it, right? And we should all be looking for those examples and those stories.
And I'd just build on what Jerry was just saying. Joanne, our CCL chapter just hosted an electrification fair locally in our area. We had about 200 people show up, and we had about 20 exhibitors. It was a combination of local folks who were interested in the area, nonprofits, and folks who were promoting electrification, and local contractors, some solar, some HVAC guys who are known, so local representatives of doing both heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and other installations. As part of that, we created a website. I dropped the website in the chat, and it has in one place kind of for homeowner oriented answers about here's how you may want to do electrification. There's a ton of great material that's out there from Rewiring America and Electrify Now and all of that. And the feedback we got was that they liked the fact that it was all pulled together in one place. They could access everything. There's also a lot of the local exhibitors listed there, but all the national organizations too. So a lot of material there, including tabling material that you can use.
Thanks for sharing. That sounds like an amazing event. Really great. And another thing that strikes me is that our state's Green Bank actually has a list of vetted contractors, which we might consider using, because the biggest thing that I hear is, my air conditioning guy tried to unsell me on a heat pump, and my friend had to call me at the last second and say, "Wait, they say this isn't realistic," but and it is. So I appreciate all those thoughts.
Well, and the one thing which I also add, which Jay was alluding to, we had folks walking around with badges saying, "I'm an electrifier." And so we had probably a dozen people who had, gotten through the process. And I think that brought in a lot of people who I want to talk to someone who's done it, who's much farther along in the process than me. And, that word of mouth, I think that's really to a great extent where we are today.
And I'll add one other piece to that, Mark. I think it's really important because, that's how it's like epidemics, right? That's how you spread the disease. We hope the disease of electrification. But the other part of that is that it also protects us as consumers because there's a lot of people out there overcharging us for this stuff, and we need to take care of each other so we don't get a bad name because someone spends way too much money for something they didn't have to.
Jay, I know we're running low on time, but if I could just add two things on that, because that's been a big important topic here in Montgomery County. And where we found a lot of interest is from a safety perspective, and where we were able to really piggyback on the material that the county already had with respect to that. Gas accidents are significantly higher than people actually think that they are, and they cause a lot of interest in electrification. The other thing that we do is we have a technical assistance program where we work with contractors to fund feasibility studies. And when we fund their feasibility studies, we'll provide a range of subsidization from 25% up to 100%. Electrification is always 100% because they do fight it at first and say, no, thanks, we don't want to do this. It's not feasible. But then it turns out it is. And actually 65% of our portfolio right now is in multifamily buildings where they almost all said, no, it's not feasible at first. And it's become that way. So really catalyzing those technical providers with the technical expertise has been such a huge activity for us as well.
That's incredible. Steve, do you have anything about that in terms of case studies or something on your website that we could link to? That's a great, great nugget.
Yeah, we certainly do. And I'll pass this around, but it is on our website as well. Our fiscal year 24 annual report shows a couple of those case studies and that focus, but I'll make sure to email that as well.
All right. Well, we are a minute past the top of the hour, so our formal time is done. I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes with folks and, just keep the conversation flowing, but by all means, jump off if you like. Thank you so much, everybody.
Hey, Pete, while people are jumping off, one follow-up question for you. You mentioned putting a $1 bill or a $20 bill. What's your true risk tolerance on that with the induction stove? Would you go for a 50, 100?
I've done a $100 bill. And in fact, that was an induction cooking demo in my own home for realtors, and which is, I think, a really great audience because even though it's the Gas Association's marketing department that has created the myth, the perception that a gourmet kitchen starts with a gas stove, the realtor industry certainly is perpetuators of that myth, right? And so before the realtors got there, I put the $100 bill under the pot to boil water for pasta. And then as it was boiling, I lifted it up. There were gasps of surprise. And one person even said, "Did you know that was there?" And I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying, no, to me, $100 bills are like, nickels and pocket change in your couch to you. But I refrained.
Oh, man.
And that was under boiling water for 10 minutes.
Pete,
Unharmed.
I didn't know that the Coast Guard gave such a good retirement pension. I joined the wrong service.
Question. I came in late. Steve, do you represent a CCL group or something in addition? I see the abbreviation MCGB, whatever that means to me.
Yeah, it's a Montgomery County Green Bank in Montgomery County, Maryland.
Okay. So you're in the middle of all this for sure.
Absolutely.
And I do want to recognize, I don't know if Suzanne's still on here, that, Steve, and I appreciate you being here as a U.S. Green Building Council member as well, because this was a joint effort with USGBC. So I do want to recognize that we have friends out there, and there's chapters in all the states and many locally of members that think the same way, and go reach out and have a conversation with your USGBC friends.
Yeah, we have a lot of cross-pollination, and thank you, Steve, for coming in to help us out with this. And hopefully we can do more stuff with CCL because we're definitely talking the same language, and USGBC has really been working on trying to expand the choir. So we're not preaching to our own people, but there's a lot of people who are interested in this message. So very glad that our choir was expanded by 30 people tonight. So thank you.
Hey Jay, this is Bob in Atlanta. When we're tabling, we usually use the rewiring flyers that we have, and something else is on the back. And I just wondered what you thought about just continuing to use that, because we have no reason to think, hey, the money, I think, for Georgia especially, may be reliable yet. Any opinions on that?
Well, number one is the state rebates are out, so I feel good about the state rebates. So, I do think, Bob, it probably about due, we probably ought to, as an organization, reach out to GFA and just have a conversation with them as to how that's playing out. They were down at the Sustainable Atlanta Roundtable last Friday, talking about that. So, I think, as you know, all the investments in Georgia, a lot of the tax credits are going to stay. So, I think, I think, what is it? The light bulb looks good in Georgia for us to do some things on that. I think part of what we want to try to do on tabling though is probably, as we said, get get beyond just the literature to people that are actually saying, here's what we're doing and how you do it, and be a little bit more, demonstrative, I guess, as Pete has talked about, to get people to really think about it and see it beyond just a piece of paper. But anyway, my 2 cents worth.
Right.
But I think the rebates will be good. So I don't think we have to worry about the rebates.
Right,
at least until the appropriations runs out. And then after that, just like every other state, you have to wait till the next year.
Thank you.
All right. Hey, Kevin.
Hey, Pete. There's a regional CCL meeting in New York in April, and I'm planning to set up a table there to advertise Rewiring America's electric coach program. Has anybody done that at other CCL meetings or elsewhere?
I haven't promoted it at CCL meetings. I've talked about it in passing, but haven't done any dedicated talking about it. I am talking in my medium city of Long Beach, California, 500,000 people. I'm talking with the building department and with city council people about maybe starting a local coaching program, and also with U.S. Green Building Council, California. But I haven't gotten beyond the shiny idea stage of that discussion yet. So,
all right. Well, I'm in the latest cohort. There are about 250 people in that group.
Oh, wow.
And I know that a couple of them are CCL members.
I did it last April, and we had 4 or 5 CCLers, including Jay and I, both were in that same cohort. And there's been others around the country. So, and there's a number of regional attempts to sort of organize coaches. There's a pretty well organized coaching cohort or group in DMV, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, with Bob Sewell.
Okay, Bob Sewell. I know him. All right, great. Yeah, I'm interested in learning what works and what works well.
Yeah, the one suggestion, the one suggestion I have with the electrical coaching, Suzanne, I don't know, that maybe, as Pete, as you say, USGBC opportunity here. It is a pretty dense program and it's pretty clunky. This is the best way to put it. I didn't find it to be very user friendly. And, if you don't, unless you're a really dedicated person, that by damn it, you're going to go do it. And it'd be really good if we could do a electrification coach light, right? For the average dude or homeowner or gal or whatever we want to call it, that touches on things that you can do without going into the depth that it does, that can keep people's attention, keep them entertained, but give them enough information to move forward. That maybe it leads them to the deeper one, right? But there's a need out there for that. And I don't know who would be best to fit it, but I think we ought to think about it, Pete, as you're doing ideation around some variant of a coach program.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge because, you just criticized it for having essentially too much content and, maybe not as well presented as it could have been. On the other hand, these are going to be volunteers talking to neighbors and community members, but they have to have some idea of accurate information to share. And, so, and one of the things that the groups that are attempting to become more formal in regions, one of the challenges they're having is liability. What if one of our volunteers in this newly organized group gives out bogus information? Are we going to get sued? And none of the volunteers, or few of them, are licensed engineers or architects, and they're not doing this work in that capacity. So, we got to give people enough information to do a credible job. Anyway, well, that's super. I'm going to have to run here. I can leave the Zoom line open, but I'm going to have to jump off and go take care of some other business.
I do need to jump
Everyone
too.
for
So
joining.
thank you again for the invitation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Steve, great to
Thanks,
meet you.
Steve.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Michael. Good job.
And Steve.
Good job, Michael.
Appreciate it. Talk to you guys soon.
I'm going to cut the recording now.